Greetings, lovers of lore. Thank you for joining me for the fourth installment of the Dominaria United story. In the previous installment, we left off with Karn, Joda, Teferi, and Jaya in the heart of hostile Phyrexian territory, while they were fearfully waiting for the Weatherlight to come to their rescue. And it does indeed. This part of the story actually carries on where they've already been picked up by the Weatherlight. So there was a daring rescue, they climbed up the little rope ladder, and they're now on board the Weatherlight. Acclimatizing Karn himself actually is very happy to be on board. It's nostalgic and comfortable for him. You may not be aware, but Karn was actually there when the Weatherlight was originally created. So it's like an old friend to him. Now everyone is given time to recover, and then they gathered together in the stateroom of the Weatherlight. That's where they had Teferi. He was being healed by Ralph Capuchin. Shanna, the captain of the Weatherlight, was there, as well as the vampire Arvad, the angel Tiana, and even the saproling Slimefoot. All of the new members of the crew were somewhere nearby. Shanna says to Karn, "This may be my ship, but you tell me where we need to take the Weatherlight." And Karn explains that we need to get the Phyrexians out into the open. So we're going to use bait of the finest type, specifically the Mana Rig, the Silex, and Karn are to be the bait in this situation. But Joda's hesitant. This is a big risk. Jay is taking the other side of the coin, saying that this risk is worth it because it will allow them to cut the Phyrexians out at the roots. At this point, Argive has fallen to Phyrexia. So they decide that they need to recruit allies, and they're going to split up to seek out these different allies. So Jaya is going to go and find Danitha Capuchin. Joda is going to head over to the area of the Yavimaya forest and try and entreat the elves to join up, while Karn is going to go to the Mana Rig where Joyra is so that he can record the information that he knows about the Silex in case something happens to him. Teferi decides he's going to accompany Karn as well. While Karn is doing that work with the Silex, Teferi will instead seek out the Viashino and recruit them to the cause. At this point, Jaya brings up a very valid question. If everybody splits up, how are we going to know if anyone is compromised by Phyrexia? And Karn points out that his scrying device allows him to determine who has some sort of Phyrexian influence because it will cause them to appear in a misty form, basically giving them away. That being settled, they set off, first of all dropping Jaya off in the Red Iron Mountains, which for her was an idyllic location. In fact, she thought if she was the kind of person who was to retire, this would be a great place to spend a considerable amount of time, just living in a nice cabin away from the majority of society, enjoying nature. Her thoughts were interrupted by Ajani, who showed up saying that Danitha told him where to find her. Jaya asked about the fate of Aaron Capuchin, because when she last saw Ajani, he was trying to save him. Ajani explained that he had been outdistanced by the Phyrexians, and while he was tracking them, he had run into Danitha. As they were talking about her, Danitha actually showed up. Ajani turned to her and said, "I've tracked the Phyrexians. They have a base located in some caves to the south." At this point, Jaya is trying to enlist Danitha. Dana's not interested in doing anything other than trying to rescue her father. So she says, "If you help me save my father, then I will help you with this Phyrexian issue." Jaya is on board immediately, snapping her fingers with a little flame above them, saying, "Let's smoke them out then." Then the story turns to Joda. He's been dropped over in the ruins of Krug in Yavimaya. This is where Maria leads the elves, and Joda finds her and learns that she's actually incredibly young. Now, Joda was surprised to see that the elves were being led by somebody who was so young, but he was more surprised to learn that they had started to incorporate Thran technology into their actual garments. So after discussing the Phyrexian situation with Maria, she was unwilling to leave her homelands. She said the elves would fight the Phyrexian menace if it appeared in the forest, but they would not go to Shiv. Now, Joda wasn't really willing to give up that easily, so he pointed out that Phyrexia can easily infiltrate here, you know. But Maria wasn't concerned. She said, when the Yavimaya forest allows us to return, then Multani will take care of any sleeper agents. Joda persisted though. It's better to fight elsewhere. You don't want to let Yavimaya burn. But ultimately, his words didn't accomplish anything because Maria just smiled at him, but her mind remained unchanged. The elves would not be joining the fight. The story then turns to what's going on over at the Phyrexians hiding out in the cave area. There are 2 guards that are big Phyrexian monstrosities placed out front of the cave. Danitha, Jaya, and Ajani are surveying the situation. Ajani has taken 6 elvish scouts to go around and clear the perimeter, and he was able to do so successfully. To handle the guards in front of the cave, Jaya ignited the air. The underbrush ignited and started to send waves of smoke up, and this caused the Phyrexian guards to charge forward, and the Benalish knights ran into them and hacked them into pieces. But those pieces started to scurry around individually, at which point they were herded out where Jaya could turn her fire magic onto them. Unfortunately, the plan did not go as anticipated, as waves of Phyrexians poured out of the cave. Jaya created a vortex shield of fire all around her and started blasting Phyrexians. The Benalish knights were getting decimated by these new Phyrexian troops, so Ajani and his scouts charged forward into them, and he cuts a bunch of them down, but more arrive. And worse than that, at their head is a Phyrexian with 4 distinctive arms. And he says, I was hoping to see some of my former crew here. It turns out it's Urtai from all the way back, the original Weatherlight crew. He has somehow been brought here, and he is now leading these Phyrexian troops, and he beckons, and Aaron Capuchin, Danitha's father, steps forward out of the darkness. Now back over at the Mana Rig, Teferi's negotiations aren't going so well. The dragons are still thinking about whether they want to be involved in this coalition. The Gitu won't commit unless the dragons commit, and it's the exact same scenario with the Viashino. The only troops that were willing to commit themselves were the goblins, and they were only doing so they could say, we were the first to join the alliance. So Teferi returned to the Weatherlight to await the decision of the dragons. But one day a flying Phyrexian monstrosity appears. It had located the Weatherlight, and it was so powerful that the Weatherlight wasn't able to fight it off on its own. Its harpoons were doing very little to it. Essentially, all of its weapons were useless against this Phyrexian. But luckily, at the last moment, Daragaz, the dragon, comes barreling in, smashing into the Phyrexian's body. And as he slams into it, he obliterates it. Its body shreds into all these pieces. And Daragaz, knowing the nature of the Phyrexians, instantly turns his massively hot dragon breath on these pieces, burning them into nothingness. After that epic display, he makes a big show of saying, Planeswalker Teferi, I accept your proposal to fight here at Shiv. And Teferi turned around and accepted with just as much ceremony. Now back over at the cave where we've just seen Urtai for the first time, Aaron Capuchin has stepped out of the darkness, but he is now Phyrexian. It's obvious, but there's something different. He's very aware. You can tell he knows that he's still human, and he's horrified by it. And he's also been put together in a far more artful way than a regular Phyrexian. With a gesture, Urtai makes Aaron's face open up wide and display his steel skull and crystal lens eyes and a brain that was encased in beautiful glass. It was actually breathtaking to look at. But Danitha, obviously, is horrified by this. So she stalks forward, blade out, ready to go. And at another gesture from Urtai, Aaron's face snaps shut and he leaps forward with his blade, lunging at his own daughter. Now Danitha was not expecting this. She's surprised, but she also can see that there's some really weird movements going on with Aaron, right? He basically is obviously trying to fight back against Urtai's control, but he's not able to fully do so. All he can do is say through struggling lips, do your duty. And Danitha tearfully, "Yes, father," and sidesteps and hacks his head clean off of his body, and it bounces and rolls in the dirt as the tears streak down her face. But Urtai ruins the moment in a comical fashion by saying, "I guess I'm gonna have to sew that back on now. Nobody appreciates my art." And again, Urtai gestures. I love that he is here. At his gesture, the mountain explodes and a giant Phyrexian dreadnought comes lumbering out. It is so massive, it is so oppressive that Jaya just stares up at it and says, "How do you even fight that?" Now back over at Yavimaya, things have gotten bad. The animals are freaking out in the forest, and it becomes apparent the reason for that really quickly. There is a dragon engine that has found its way to the forest, and it opens its mouth and lets forth a massive roar. And this roar is so deep that Joda can't hear it. He can only feel it reverberating through his body, echoing in his heart. But you can see the effect of it all around him. Tree branches shattered. Birds fell from the sky, bleeding from the eyes. And that's when Joda realized there was a trickle of blood coming from his own mouth. The dragon engine barreled forward, tearing through Yavimaya, uprooting massive Magnagoth trees that had stood for centuries. Maria, that sweet young elf child, was just completely unprepared for this. She was totally shocked. Those trees were her entire life. They had been around for longer than her. So she rallied her elven troops and at the same time discovered fresh hope. While these Magnagoth trees, their lives had been taken, by them being uprooted, it had uncovered the hidden Thran city that lived underneath of Krug originally. And that meant a bunch of Thran artifacts were now glinting up into the sunlight. And down within them, Maria spotted the salvation that they would need. As the dragon engine grew closer, Joda could actually make out that Rona was the one who was operating it. He was able to figure out who she was based on the description that Karn had provided. There was another horrific realization. Parts of the dragon engine had been made up out of forest creatures. Rona had been using the forest dwellers to repair the dragon engine. At Maria's command, the elves loosed arrows at the dragon engine, but it had absolutely no offense, just pinging off of its metal shell. And the dragon engine started to draw in a massive amount of power. Returning to the fight with the Phyrexian dreadnought, it is going wild, swinging its massive body around, crushing Benelish and Phyrexian alike with no cares. It is spewing acid everywhere. It's melting trees. One of the creeks nearby is boiled away by the acid. And further away from where the battle is happening, avalanches are raining down. That's the level this dreadnought is having on the terrain. The elves here are also finding that arrows are not effective against these type of Phyrexians. Urtai, however, calls out, "Stop, Danitha, call off your fighters." Danitha's skeptical. Why would I even consider doing that? Urtai just points at the dreadnought, and Danitha quickly gets the point that if she doesn't do what he says, he's just going to unleash this thing on everyone. So she raises her hand and calls off her troops. At that point, Urtai turns to Jaya and Ajani and says, "You need to surrender or everyone here dies now." The story bounces back to Joda and Maria now, where Joda has erected a magical barrier against the dragon engine, but it's only strong enough for one blast. Anything more than that, and they're done for. So Maria says that they need to get their hands on that artifact and begs Joda to leave the shield in front of her people and come with her to retrieve the artifact. And Joda agrees. Miria took her spear and activated a hidden power that turned it into a Thran glider. Using that, her and Joda were able to glide down towards the dragon engine, at the last moment crashing down into a crater of water right at the dragon's feet. Joda looked up at the dragon engine and prepared his magic, while Maria sunk down to her knees and started fishing around in the muck. She knew it was somewhere nearby. The dragon engine unleashed another massive roar blast, and Joda used his magic to try and shield him and Maria and the others at the same time, and barely managed to do so. But luckily, Miria used that time to find the artifact that they were looking for. And not a moment too soon, because Joda had noticed that Rona was now looking his way, and she was probably going to direct the dragon engine's full power at him. He looked over and saw that Miria held a muck-covered silver globe. She was rotating it and activating the glyphs that were embedded in its sides. She looked up at Joda and said, "How fast can you get us out of here?" Joda used the last scraps of his magic to tear open a portal. It felt like he was using his bare hands to tear at a stone wall, and they barely made it through before the artifact triggered its effect, causing a massive vacuum sphere to whip out around the dragon engine. Now, because the dragon engine had been rampaging through the forest, there had been all kinds of pollen and dust thrown up into the air, and it all helped to highlight this void of nothingness that circled the dragon engine. And this vacuum cut off the voice of the dragon, so you could see that it was roaring and raging in the center of this sphere, but it could do nothing as its organic pieces started to die, and its metal pieces started to freeze up and get all brittle and snap. As the lights in the dragon engine's eyes faded out, it started to stumble forwards, Rona trying to control it to get it out of the sphere, but she didn't manage to do it. So the dragon engine's body collapsed half outside the sphere, and Rona was able to scramble out of it, barely alive, struggling for breath. A moment later, Rona was on her feet and running. Maria made a gesture, and a number of elves on Kevu gave chase. Miria looked sadly over at Joda. "They'll find us everywhere, won't they?" Joda nodded grimly back. Maria said, "There's only one path for the elves forward now. We join the alliance." Now the story goes back to the battle with Urtai and the massive dreadnought. Jay is not willing to surrender here, so she buys a little bit of time saying, "How can I possibly trust you in this scenario?" The point becomes moot, however, as a golden flying ship comes careening in, and hundreds upon hundreds of Keldan warriors rain down from the sky, all with cleated boots that slam into the back of the Phyrexian dreadnought. And as they land, each of these Keldan warriors drive massive swords into the dreadnought's back so that they don't fall off. It was the Golden Argosy, an ancient artifact that Radha had found. She had shown up with all of her troops. But the Phyrexians weren't just going to stand by. In fact, nearby monstrosities noticed the Keldan warriors up on the back of the dreadnought, and they started to scale up its sides so they could bring the battle to the Keldans. Ajani attempted to stop them by having his elvish archers fire on the monstrosities as they were scrambling up the side of the dreadnought. Jaya helped out by lobbing fireballs as well. And at that point, Radha comes leaping down from the Golden Argosy, and she drives her sword straight into one of the eyes of the dreadnought, cutting a space for her to stand. This makes her Keldan warriors fight even harder, hacking deeper into the beast, and the dreadnought screams and thrashes about, ultimately succumbing to its wounds as Urtai flees. The survivors all cheered. Back at the Mana Rig, Joyra confronts Karn about all of those unanswered letters that she sent. And Karn takes the time to apologize. They both talk about their feelings involving Venser and his sacrifice. And then Joyra shows Karn the artifact she has that she's going to place in the Mana Rig to allow her to self-destruct the Mana Rig if it were to ever fall into Phyrexian hands. Karn and Joyra are both surprised as the communication device that they use to summon the Weatherlight actually lights up with the voice of Joda coming through. He says to Karn that he's enlisted the help of the elves. They are traveling by tree folk, but he can't wait to get there to let him know something very important. Karn asks what the important news is, and Joda drops the bomb. There's a spy in the new coalition. All right, my friends, that ends this installment of the Dominaria United lore. I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you really like what we're doing here, then you can consider supporting us by joining our Patreon or the channel membership. Thanks for coming by. And remember, my friends, lore is life.